The snow had a strange way of devouring sound out there on the open prairie, where the land wore white like a burial shroud, and even the crows held their silence. Colt Avery rode alone, the faint crunch of his horse's hooves the only rhythm in a world hushed by winter, a rhythm pressed deep into memory, slow and more patient than sorrow. Above him, the sky stretched wide and hollow, the same color as regret, as if even it had grown tired of trying. Colt wasn't headed to any place in particular. Men like him didn't arrive at places. They drifted toward them, like deadwood carried by a current. Since the war, since the black powder smoke and the slow stink of men dying inch by inch, he'd wandered the spine of the land with little more than a water canteen, a six-shooter he barely touched, and a journal he never had the heart to write in. Some men carried crosses. Colt bore silence. It was in that silence that he first noticed the smoke, thin and curling, a hesitant thread against the dull sky, rising like it wasn't sure it had a right to. He squinted into the wind, a chill twisting in his gut. Smoke out here, in this kind of weather, rarely meant anything good. His horse shifted beneath him, nostrils flaring, catching the scent of something long extinguished but not forgotten. When Colt crested the rise, the world below opened up like the aftermath of sin too old to name. A wagon sat blackened and broken, its wheels sunken into the snow, the canvas roof burned to curling tatters. The air still carried the sharp, bitter stench of scorched timber and flesh. Above, buzzards circled slowly, indifferent as old gods. He dismounted in silence, boots crunching over crusted snow, the rifle slung across his back untouched but heavy with presence. Whatever had happened here was long over. What remained was not in need of judgment but of reckoning. Then came the sound, a cry, faint and wet and unmistakably human. Colt froze, ears tuned like a hunting dog. Another cry followed, closer this time. He stepped over the charred skeleton of a barrel, eyes scanning the wreckage, and then he saw her, a figure slumped in the snow, wrapped in a tangled mess of blankets and soiled cloth. Her arms were curled protectively around something that moved, that squirmed, that cried again, desperate and shrill, a sound clinging to life. He knelt. The woman's face was smudged with ash, hollow and bone-pale, but unmistakably alive. Her eyes, dark as polished river stones, blinked once, slow, deliberate. No words came, no movement, just the barest flicker of presence. Nestled to her chest, wrapped in what looked like a man's old coat, was a baby. The child turned his face toward Colt, guided by some infant sense. Cheeks red raw from the cold, nose running, lips cracked from the air. But when their eyes met, eyes too young to know sorrow, the baby smiled. It was a smile that reached into Colt's chest and gently unstitched something that had been tightly knotted for years. He didn't know what it was, only that it hurt in the softest, most unbearable way. "Easy," Colt said, though the wind stole most of his voice. "I got you, both of you." He unstrapped his saddle blanket, draped it over them with careful hands, gently peeling the baby away just enough to check for injuries. The woman stirred but did not resist. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. That's when he noticed the bruises. Purple swelling along her jaw, the red marks circling her wrists like shackles, rope burns. Something colder than the wind settled deep in his chest. The wagon, he realized, had been torched from within, intentionally, whether by raiders, outlaws, or something darker, he didn't yet know. But she hadn't just survived fire, she'd been chased by it. Colt moved with purpose. He built a fire using half-dried kindling and tinder from his pack, sheltering it against the lee side of the wagon's charred remains. He swaddled the baby in another blanket and stripped off his own coat to lay it over the woman. She didn't flinch, but her breathing deepened. He eased her back against the scorched frame of a wagon wheel. The baby dozed in his arms, one tiny hand curled around a twist of Colt's collar. Like he knew this stranger was the only barrier between him and the freeze. Night fell slow, like a bruise across the sky, the stars reluctant and shy. Colt sat by the fire, muscles drawn tight, eyes half closed. He didn't sleep. He hadn't truly slept since the war, or since the choices he made after it. The woman remained silent through the night. She drank when he offered his flask, chewed on jerky without complaint, but kept her eyes fixed on the flames. Her hands never strayed far from a baby. Colt didn't ask her name. Names belonged to a different world, one with Sunday suppers and letters from home. Out here, they were just souls in the cold, surviving by inches. Morning came blue and brutal, snow dusting the blackened wagon like frost on a grave. The baby woke first, babbling nonsense and slapping at the light. Colt handed him back to her gently. She took him without a word. They rode double on Colt's horse, slow and uneven. He wrapped her legs with a spare blanket, adjusted her arms to keep the child secure. She didn't resist. Her silence had changed, not a barrier now, but a fog, not impenetrable, just far away. They reached Black Hollow by dusk, a crooked mining town nestled into a bend in the hills. Its buildings slouched from years of wind and soot. Smoke rose from chimneys. Horses lined hitching rails. Every face that turned to meet them wore the same expression, wearied suspicion. Colt knew how they looked. A trail-stained drifter on a tired horse, carrying a mute woman and a baby swaddled in mismatched rags. They didn't look like family, didn't look like neighbors. They looked like trouble. He ignored the stares. The general store's bell rang sharp as flint when he entered. Old Maester stood behind the counter, her gray hair twisted into a knot, her eyes sharp enough to skin a man. "Ain't you dragging shadows today?" she said. "Need food, blankets, milk, if you've got it," Colt replied. She glanced at the woman and the child. Her expression didn't soften. "She ain't right in the head," Maester muttered. "That one's hollow." Colt said nothing. Her judgment hung in the air like smoke. He paid with coin he didn't really have and took what he could carry. The sheriff stopped him outside the church. "Drifter," he said, his voice flat. "That your kin?" Colt looked him over. Too clean for a town so dirty. The kind of man who polished his badge to distract from rusted morals. "She's with me," Colt said. "For now." "She got a name?" Colt met his eyes. "She'll speak when she's ready." The sheriff sniffed. "Don't bring trouble. Black Hollow's peaceable. We keep to our own." Colt didn't blink. "That's so." He didn't wait for permission. Behind the chapel, the barn door creaked open without resistance. Preacher Josiah didn't show himself, but a lantern had been left burning on the step. A wordless gesture, unsure but not unkind. That night, Colt laid down straw, sackcloth for bedding. The woman helped, her movement steadier. Still silent, but alert, she kept the baby close. Colt didn't question it. He didn't sleep either. But the quiet felt different. Not hollow. Not this time. She hummed low while holding the child, a melody too soft a name, foreign and mournful. It barely reached the air, but it was music. In that thread of sound, Colt heard something older than pain. She didn't look at him as she sang, but she didn't look away either. He leaned against the beam, firelight warm against his boots, the wind clawing outside the barn. But inside it was more than warm. It was human. The baby slept smiling, and Colt, for the first time in years, closed his eyes and didn't dream of blood. He dreamed of a snow-covered trail, a broken wagon, and a child who smiled at him like he was worth believing in. The wind in Black Hollow always smelled of smoke and something sour, regret soaked too long in wood and memory. It clung to storefronts and skin. Colt felt it as soon as he stepped out, Ruth and the baby falling into his shadow. 3 days since they'd arrived. 3 days of careful silences and doors left unlatched. Preacher Josiah hadn't spoken much, but food appeared by the barn, a folded quilt on a bench. Kindness in the shape of small things. Colt did what he knew best. Work. He chopped behind the saloon, hauled hay, fixed a chapel hinge. Each task earned coin or shelter, or at least a reason not to be run out. The townsfolk didn't refuse him, but they didn't welcome him either. Their eyes slid past him, always finding Ruth. She swept the chapel steps every morning, wrapped in an old patch cloak may had surrendered in trade for Colt mending her porch rail. Ruth never spoke. She moved like she didn't want to disturb the dust. Her eyes downcast, her mouth set like it was holding something in. Colt watched her more than he meant to. Not because she was beautiful, though she was in a way carved by pain, but because she wore silence like a second skin, a language he hadn't learned to read. The baby, Mason, was the only noise between them, gurgling, reaching, demanding joy from a world that had nearly left him behind. One morning, while Colt stacked wood, the sheriff came again, voice taut. "You planning on staying?" Colt didn't look up. "Wasn't planning anything." "Folk are nervous," the sheriff said. "No one knows where she came from. That makes people uneasy." Colt let the axe fall, turned slow. "She's breathed quiet and cared for a boy. That's all. She ain't kin. Not your wife. You got no right dragging her into our peace." Colt stepped closer. "You see much peace, Sheriff?" The lawman's jaw flexed. "Don't make me regret tolerating you." Colt didn't blink. "Not planning on giving you reason." That night, Ruth left half her bread on Colt's side of their makeshift table. She said nothing, just placed it gently, then sat and rocked Mason in time with the crackling fire. Trust in a silence warmer than words. Word spread. By week's end, they weren't strangers anymore. They were a story. Ruth became the haunted girl. May swore she'd seen her stare down a preacher's wife without blinking. Others whispered scandal, madness, or curses. When Colt entered the saloon to ask for a job, fixing a roof, the room stilled. "Got a name?" the barkeep asked. "Avery. Colt Avery. Ain't no kin here." "Don't need any." He got the job. But no one drank near him. Back at the barn, Ruth sat cross-legged on a blanket, mending Mason's sleeve. The child slept, arms splayed like he'd conquered a kingdom in his dreams. Colt sat beside them, quiet. Ruth held up her stitches, small, careful, perfect. Their eyes met. In hers, a question. "Am I doing right by him?" Colt's nod was quiet but full. "You are." Then she reached into her satchel and drew out a tiny carved animal, smooth from handling. She placed it near his boot, nudged it forward. "You make this?" Colt asked. She shook her head. "Yours." A nod. He picked it up, turned in his fingers, then set it gently beside her again. She didn't reclaim it, just watched the fire, her shoulders no longer tight. Days passed, and the space between them shrank. Ruth still said nothing, but she was nearer, her presence a comfort. Her gift small, a folded blanket, a cup refilled, an apple shared. Mason adored him, reached for him like he belonged. But not all hearts thawed. One afternoon behind the general store, two young men cornered Colt. She the one with a burned wagon, one sneered. Colt didn't look up. "Ain't your business." Maybe she lit herself. Women like that ain't right. Colt straightened, wiped his hands. "You done?" "Not yet," said the second. Sheriff said keep peace. That means watching strangers. Colt moved before they finished. Slammed the first man into the wall, forearm tight against his throat. The second froze, his hand hovering at his belt. Colt's glare rooted him to the spot. He didn't need words. His silence said enough. "I don't start fights," Colt said, voice low, calm as a drawn blade. "But I finished them. And if you so much as speak again in that tone, you'll be drinking through a tube." He let the man go. Neither spoke again. They left with bruised pride and the jumpy eyes of cowards who'd expected less resistance. Colt never told Ruth about it. He didn't need to. That night, as she passed on the baby near the stove, her fingers touched his shoulder, just briefly, just through the thin cloth of his shirt. But it was the first time she'd initiated contact. A quiet gesture that said everything. A few nights later, with wind screaming like a banshee across the barn eaves, Colt woke to crying, not Mason, but Ruth. The sound was raw, strangled, like someone who'd forgotten how to cry and had just now remembered. He didn't move, didn't speak, just lay still listening. Her sobs broke through the quiet like the cracking of a dam, silent for so long it couldn't hold any more. When the weeping stopped, it left behind a silence that was heavier, yes, but somehow clearer, as if something essential had finally been released. The next morning, she handed him tea without a word. Her eyes were red, but she met his gaze and didn't look away. There was a nod between them, small, almost imperceptible, but full of meaning. She was beginning to speak, even if her voice hadn't yet found form. The barn became more than just shelter. It became home, not in the simple, safe way people meant it, but in the way only those who have suffered together understand. A sanctuary built from ash and endurance. One night, Mason took his first wobbly steps across the barn, his arms flailing wide, knees uncertain, before collapsing giggling into Colt's chest. Ruth smiled, a true smile, not something ghosted or borrowed. It bloomed across her face like spring after a brutal frost. Colt didn't say anything. He just held the boy and looked at her like the moment might vanish if he dared blink. Preacher Josiah brought them an old oil lamp one evening, muttering something about God's light in dark corners. He didn't stay, but when Colt thanked him, the preacher didn't turn away so quickly this time. The sheriff never came back, though his eyes were often spotted on porches and behind windows, always watching, always weighing. Colt didn't care. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was beginning to belong. Then came the snow again, soft and steady, falling like forgiveness, muffling the world in a hush so deep it felt like beginning anew. Mason laughed at the flakes, clumsily trying to catch them with his tongue. Ruth stood beside Colt at the barn's threshold, her eyes lifted skyward, and then, without word or warning, she reached out and took his hand. No speeches, no dramatic gesture, just her hand, warm and certain, wrapping into his as the snow danced around him like grace. And standing there, with two souls he hadn't known he needed, Colt felt something shift inside him. He wasn't drifting anymore. He wasn't wandering. He was rooted. But peace, he knew, was rarely left undisturbed. He'd learned, somewhere between the killing fields and the endless wandering, that some kinds of silence held more weight than even the loudest scream. Ruth's silence had shifted. It no longer shut him out. It invited him in. Each morning she swept the chapel steps. Each night, she hummed, a half-formed melody that never quite found its ending. They still didn't speak in sentences, but they communicated in glances, in the way a cup was passed, in how a blanket was pulled tighter around Mason's sleeping form. Mason, oblivious to the careful dance of unspoken grief, grew stronger every day. His laugh filled the barn like sunshine through broken rafters. He toddled between them now, babbling with the confidence of someone who had never known fear. Sometimes Colt caught the child's fire-colored eyes watching him, and it felt like forgiveness, like maybe, just maybe, he'd done something right in this life. It was Ruth who began to draw first. She found a stub of charcoal near the stove and started sketching on the barn wall. At first it was simple. Mountains, birds, what looked like a crooked little house. Then came figures. A tall man, stooped slightly. A woman upright, composed. A child with arms too wide for his body. Colt sat beside her in silence, watching as she shaped their story into lines and shadows. He didn't ask what it meant. She didn't offer. She didn't need to. The sketch told it all. The three of them beneath a lopsided sun. That night, after Mason fell asleep beside the stove, Ruth reached for the journal Colt always kept tucked nearby. Her fingers brushed his knee before pulling back. Hesitant, asking. Colt handed it to her, without hesitation. She opened the worn leather cover, flipped past the blank pages that had haunted him for years, and stared at the first clean one. Then she pressed the charcoal to paper. The sketch she left behind wasn't the past. It was a wish. A wagon intact, rolling under a starblind sky. A woman inside, cradling a child. A man riding beside it. Their faces weren't detailed, but their closeness was. She handed him back the journal, her hands lingering on his longer than necessary. Colt, unsure what to call what they were building together, only nodded. "Thank you," he whispered. The next day, the wind turned sharp, and with it came a strange hush. People looked away too quickly. May barely spoke when Colt came for flour. Preacher Hembry's eyes were sunken with shadows. The sheriff had vanished. Colt recognized the tension. It was the kind of quiet that always came before a storm. By dusk, Ruth had grown pale, her fingers trembling as she wrapped Mason in his blanket. She stepped out to the chapel steps and sat, unmoving, eyes fixed on the distant tree lean. Colt followed, standing behind her. "They found you," he said softly. She didn't answer, but she reached for his hand. That night, she didn't hum. She just held Mason close, rocking him as though rhythm could keep the world from coming apart. Colt stayed awake beside her, oiling his rifle in steady, quiet movements. The sound of metal against cloth was the only music. His mind drifted, as it often did, back to the war. But not to blood this time. Not to the screaming. To fear. Fear of losing something he hadn't yet found the courage to name. Near dawn, she spoke. Just one word. Husband. Her voice was torn and used, but it split the silence like lightning. Colt turned slowly, saw her sitting in the lantern's glow, eyes clear and haunted. She nodded once, her jaw clenched. Then she leaned down and drew in the dirt. Stick figures. One small, one taller. Two others side by side, marked by extra lines. Then she drew fire over the wagon. Understanding hit him like a punch to the gut. She had run from her husband. He'd come after her with others. They'd set the wagon alight. Left her for dead. Mason hadn't been spared out of mercy, but out of greed. A child kept his currency. She hadn't just escaped cruelty. She had escaped being sold. Colt's fist clenched. His breath tightened. Words failed him. None of them would have been enough. So he stepped forward, reached for her face with callous hands, and cupped it gently. "You're safe now," he said. Her eyes filled, though the tears stayed unshed. That afternoon, two strangers rode into Black Hollow. They didn't ask directions, didn't tie off their horses at the saloon. They moved with the confidence of men who only came to take and leave. Colt saw them from the chapel roof as he fixed the shingle, watched them scan the street like predators. One was broad-shouldered, a thick scar running down his neck. The other, lean and twitchy, his fingers always brushing his belt like they missed the weight of a weapon. Ruth hadn't seen them. Colt didn't tell her. Not yet. He walked into the general store, bought 3 days' worth of food, then returned to barn and began to pack. Ruth didn't ask questions, just bundled Mason tighter and wrapped their few belongings. Her quiet trust in him burned deeper than any vow ever could. "We'll leave tonight," Colt said. She touched his arm and shook her head. Not running. The truth of it struck him like thunder. She was done hiding. That night, with Ruth inside and Mason asleep, Colt moved like a wraith through the trees beyond the barn, circling toward the livery where the strangers had made camp. Their fire glowed dull and low. Their voices reached him through the brush. "She's here," said the broad one. "Saw her outside that chapel. Just stood there, staring." "We wait till the sheriff turns in," said the other. "Slip quiet. Take the kid. She'll follow." Colt felt something go still and ice-cold inside him, the kind of stillness that made men dangerous. He waited until they quieted, then backed away step by step, silent as dusk. He didn't sleep that night. Neither did Ruth. At dawn, Ruth dressed Mason carefully, wrapping him in the thickest blanket they owned. Colt kissed the boy's forehead, a gesture he hadn't planned but couldn't leave undone. "Stay here," he told her. She looked at him, at Mason, then nodded. The two men walked bold as daylight through the main street mid-morning. Colt stood by the chapel steps, rifle slung across one shoulder, hands relaxed at his sides. Waiting. The broad one grinned. "You Avery?" "That depends," Colt replied. "The woman and the kid, they don't belong to you." Colt's voice was iron. "They don't belong to you either." "That's his blood," the lean one snarled. "She's running with another man's boy. Ain't right." "She's free," Colt said. "He's hers. And you don't get to touch either of them." The broad one reached for his belt. Colt didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and drove his fist into the man's jaw with the force of every injustice he'd carried. The thin one lunged, but Colt swung the rifle, not to fire, but to strike. The wooden but slammed into ribs. The man gasped, dropped. Colt kicked him down, held him there in the dirt. Sheriff Holloway came running, gun drawn. "What's this?" he barked. "They came for the woman," Colt said. "Tried to take the child." Ruth stepped forward, Mason in her arms, back straight, chin high. "She's lying," one of the men gasped through blood. Ruth's voice rang out, low and unshakable. "He burned the wagon, tied me up, tried to sell me." The words dropped like stones. The sheriff stared at her, then at Colt. "She telling the truth?" Colt nodded once. "Then they'll ride out now. the sheriff said, "or I'll jail them both. You hear me?" The strangers didn't argue. They staggered to their horses, their faces twisted with rage they no longer had the strength to use. Colt watched them disappear over the ridge, then turned to Ruth. "You okay?" She didn't answer. She stepped forward, took his hand, threaded her fingers through his. Then, after a breath, she whispered, "Thank you," the first time she'd said aloud. The words settled in his chest like warmth in a winter that had almost claimed him. The oil lamp flickered in the corner, casting golden shadows along the cabin walls. Ruth moved about the room without being asked, cooking with quiet purpose, her hands sure, her back relaxed. When Mason giggled from where he played with a wooden spoon, she laughed, soft and unguarded, not with restraint but with the freedom of someone slowly remembering how. Colt sat beside her, saying nothing, but when he did, she leaned into him, her head resting just beneath his chin, as if she had always belonged there. They didn't speak that evening. There was no need. In the hush between them, something passed, something final, but not an ending. No, not that. It was a beginning they'd both fought to earn, and neither of them would turn from it again. The thaw came slowly, like hope always does, one pale morning at a time, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just slips in gently until one day the snow stops biting at your toes, and the ground softens enough to hold a footprint again. March in black, hollow wasn't kind exactly, but it wasn't cruel anymore either. And for once, Colt Avery didn't drift with the changing season. He stayed. They left the chapel barn quietly, at Preacher Hember's unspoken urging. He didn't give a speech, didn't ask them to leave, but one morning a key appeared on the church steps, left without ceremony. A muttered word followed, something about an old caretaker's cabin near the eastern ridge, and used since his brother passed on. Colt repaired the roof with rough lumber, while Ruth washed soot from the window panes until morning light shone through clean. The place wasn't much, just one room, a stovepipe, a porch that creaked when you breathed near it, but it was theirs, and that meant something. Mason grew stronger by the day, chasing chickens behind May's store and coming home with dirt under his fingernails and grass in his hair. One evening, he looked up from where he sat and called Colt Dada, whether by accident or by truth, no one could say. Ruth froze when she heard it, her eyes wide with the weight of it. Then, slowly, a smile rose, one of those deep ones she gave rarely, the kind that had to come from the bones and pass through every old scar to reach her mouth. Colt didn't correct the boy. He didn't speak at all. But that night, he held Mason a little closer, a little longer. Ruth began to speak more, her voice slow and careful, each word chosen like it had earned its place in the air. She still didn't talk much in town. The people there hadn't earned her trust. But within the four walls of that cabin, her voice threaded through the rooms like smoke, soft, lingering, warm. One night, she asked Colt what he dreamed of. He told her the truth. "I used to dream of silence," he said. "Now I dream of firewood stacked just right, and you humming while you fold Mason's things." She didn't laugh, but her eyes did, glimmering with something lighter than memory, deeper than affection. The town began to shift, or maybe it was just that they started seeing it differently. May stopped charging them full price. Preacher Hember came by in the evenings, sometimes with scripture, more often with silence and a second chair. Even Holloway, the sheriff, kept his distance, nodding Colt's way when they crossed paths, saying nothing but not looking away either. In Black Hollow, respect wasn't loud. It showed itself in the space people gave you. Then one afternoon, the boy arrived. He wasn't much older than 20, coat dusty, a shotgun slung over one shoulder with more awkwardness than skill. He handed Colt a letter with a courthouse seal from Dry Bend. Colt opened it beneath the dim porch light. The handwriting was stiff, upright, official. "Colt, Jeremiah Case is alive. He's coming for the boy. The law recognizes his blood claim." Ruth didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply looked down at Mason, who sat on the floor, humming and playing with pebbles, unaware the world had just twisted again beneath him. "Jeremiah," she said, voice like dry paper. "Your husband?" Colt asked. She nodded once. "I thought he died. I left him bleeding. I didn't look back. Colt folded the letter, walked it to the stove, and fed it to the flame. The paper curled and blackened, without ceremony. "We'll go," Ruth said. "No," Colt answered. "We've done enough running." That night, they stayed up long after Mason had fallen asleep. Ruth told him about the early years, before the baby, before the fire, about Jeremiah, how he'd charmed like a snake with polished scales. A smile too wide, words too smooth, always sounding like he was reading from a book no one else could see. She'd been young then, alone, scared. A fever had taken her people. He'd said the right things, made promises that felt like lifelines, until he stopped pretending. Then came the real man, the cold hands, the long silences, the violence, quiet, precise, and frequent. He hadn't wanted a wife. He'd wanted property. When she told him she was pregnant, he smiled and said, "That's worth something." What followed was blood, and ash, and escape. "He'll come with a badge," she warned, "or men with one." "I don't care if he comes with God himself," Colt muttered. "He's not leaving with Mason." 2 days passed like rope tightening. Everyone in town felt it. May offered them the rifle she kept hidden beneath the till. Preacher Hembra spoke to them, voice lit with fire, quoting psalms while sharpening his old shears like a man waiting for a reason. Even Holloway came to the porch, hat low. "I don't like him," the sheriff said, "but if the law backs him, my hands might be tied." Colt didn't smile. "Then let's make sure the law don't get a chance." "He won't come to the front door," Ruth said that night while stirring stew. He always preferred shadows. So Colt waited in the shadows. The night Jeremiah came, the moon hung like a brittle coin in the sky. Wind moved through the trees in whispers, soft-footed, like a warning barely spoken. Colt crouched behind a stone outcrop, rifle steady, his whole body drawn taut. He didn't need to see Jeremiah to know he was near. The air itself thickened, like the earth tried to protect the innocent from what was coming. Jeremiah stepped into the clearing with 2 men at his back, one young and nervous, the other blank-faced, dull-eyed, the sort help you buy with whiskey and lies. One of them pointed. "Cabin's just up there." Jeremiah raised a hand. He was taller now, leaner, dressed in a preacher's coat, black with silver buttons. A costume of virtue stretched over a rotting soul. "Don't need both of you," Jeremiah muttered. "Just a boy. Quiet. Clean. No fuss." "You said the woman was yours," one man said. "She was," he snapped. "Now she's baggage." That was enough. Colt stepped into the clearing. He held his rifle pointed downward, but ready. "She's not yours." The hired men froze. Jeremiah blinked, then smiled. "You must be the drifter." "I'm her family now," Colt said. "You're nothing," Jeremiah sneered. "No papers. No name. I've got the law. And I've got her." Jeremiah's smile faltered. "You'll kill a man for taking back what's his? If that man lays hands on them?" Colt's voice was ice. "Yes." The 2 hired guns exchanged glances. Unease curled around them. One shifted back half a step. "We didn't sign on for a fight," the younger muttered. "You said she ran." "This ain't running," the other added, his voice quieter. Jeremiah reached for his holster. "Don't," Colt said. The air in the clearing seemed to still. Jeremiah's hand froze. "You think you'll walk away clean if you shoot me?" "No," Colt replied, "but I'll sleep clean." Jeremiah's lip curled. "You think she loves you? You're just the next hand she grabbed while drowning." "Maybe," Colt said, "but I'm the one who pulled her out." Jeremiah's hand slipped away from his gun. He turned to go. "Go," Colt said to the others. They obeyed without question. No drama. Just boots on frost and shame left behind. Jeremiah lingered. "I'll come back," he said, voice trembling. "No," Colt answered. "You won't. Next time, I don't talk first." Something broke in Jeremiah's stare, and then he vanished into the trees. Colt waited until the darkness swallowed the last echo of his steps before turning back. Ruth stood on the porch, Mason in her arms. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. She stepped down into the dirt and placed Mason into Colt's arms. Then she kissed him, not rushed, not desperate, certain. Inside, the fire burned low. Mason yawned and curled into Colt's chest, little fingers tangling in the edge of his coat. "I was scared," Ruth whispered. "So was I." "But not of him," she said. "No," Colt answered. "Not of him." She laid her head on his shoulder. "I was scared I'd lose this." "You." "Us." He closed his eyes. "You won't." Outside, Black Hollow slept. In the morning, Ruth opened the door and stood with Colt on the porch as the sun broke golden over the ridge. The air smelled of thawing earth and pine smoke. Mason toddled out behind them, grabbed Colt's finger with a sticky hand. "Do you think he'll come back?" Ruth asked. "No," Colt said. "He's already gone." In that quiet moment, Ruth reached into her pocket and pulled out a ring, old, bent, ugly. Without a word, she tossed it into fire. They watched it burn together. Later, Colt wrote in his journal for the first time in months. "She stayed. I stayed. And maybe that's what love really is. Not something you say. Just something you don't run from." Then he closed the book, and outside, the wind shifted. Not colder, not warmer. Just changed.